Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from in the world today. Welcome to Energy and Utilities Africa Digital event, a new platform to bring together energy professionals from across the world in an interactive and safe environment to discuss key trends, opportunities and challenges facing all of us in the industry during the pandemic and beyond. I'm Andrew Roscoe, Editor of Energy and Utilities, and I will be the moderator for the session today. So firstly, 2020 has been a tough year for all of us, personally and for all our businesses. So firstly, I hope that you and your families are safe and well. And staying connected is now more important than ever. And this week has been designed to do just that, to keep you connected with your colleagues, peers and experts from around the world with regionally focused content and access to Informa's global network of contacts and connections. So the event, in a way, replacing a couple of live events we had planned. We had Egypt Energy and Nigeria Energy. So those events have been amalgamated into this, but the discussion's been more broad than that. It's been about the African continent as a whole. This week, it's not just about webinars, it's also about virtual networking. So if you haven't accessed GRIP yet, I implore you to do so. It is the world's first artificial intelligence networking tool. So please log into that and you can connect with your peers and hopefully continue the discussion that we're having and continue that discussion for a long time after the event is finished. The theme of the event is making electricity available to all, with government, private sector and international financial institutions joining energy and utilities for a series of discussions to discuss successes, failures about the electrification across the African continent to date, and sharing lessons that will help development in the future. So moving on to the final panel, maybe the most important, accelerating development by providing financing solutions to the African utilities market. I'm delighted to welcome Gareth Phillips, the Manager for Climate and Environmental Finance Division for the Africa Development Bank, Praveen Umredkar, Director of Synergy Consulting, and also Gabrielle de las Tours, the Associate Director for Energy for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So Gabrielle, it's a couple of little connection issues, so he'll hopefully be joining us soon. So we'll get the discussion underway and hopefully Gabrielle will join shortly. So firstly, I'd like just to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and maybe give a brief overview of what your organization or institution, how it's helping for utility projects in Africa. So I think we'll start with you, Gareth. Welcome.
Very good, thank you very much indeed. And I'm just going to keep my headshot on because of my bandwidth issues. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in today's event. As Andrew said, I'm Manager of Climate and Environmental Finance at the African Development Bank. And so two things I'm going to say in response to the question. Firstly is I have a team of staff and consultants who work to access funds from the main climate funds, so the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, and the Global Environment Facility. And then we also manage and access some multilateral and bilateral funds that we manage internally within the bank. And the purpose of those funds is often to support new technologies, pilot scale activities, and help the private sector manage the risks of engaging in those areas. But of course, the level of finance that we're able to access through those funds is somewhat limited, although the Green Climate Fund is a much larger fund. So it's not mainstream funding for all of the kinds of energy projects that we need, but opportunities to provide funding for new technologies, to break down barriers, to do things that are additional or transformational. And then the bank itself, more broadly, our overall mandate, of course, is to reduce poverty on the continent. And a very large part of that is about providing access to energy. So we have a very large Light Up and Power Africa program under our high fives, where we have some eye-wateringly large targets for the number of gigawatts of capacity that we want to build and the number of connections for households and so on. But needless to say, we've raised a lot of money at our recent general capital increase. Well, if we hadn't had to divert our activities to focus on COVID right now, we would be progressing in doing more energy-related projects across the continent. Let me stop there by way of introduction. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Gareth. Praveen, if you'd just like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what Synergy is doing in the African utilities market.
Thank you, Andrew. First of all, thank you for inviting me as a panelist for this webinar. I'm a director at Synergy Consulting, and in terms of introduction to Synergy, we are the international financial advisory services firm with a focus on project financing, financial modeling, financial analysis, feasibility analysis, bankability assessment, policy reform for the infrastructure sector. We have successfully achieved financial close for more than 65 billion worth of competitively tendered projects over 60 countries across the globe, which includes Africa, Asia, Middle East, as well as a few countries in America, Latin Americas and Europe. We have substantial experience in PPP projects ranging from non-conventional power, including solar, hydro, wind projects, conventional powers, including IPPs, IWPPs, and IWSPPs, desalination, wastewater, district cooling, district heating, transports. We cover all infrastructure projects in all sectors when it comes to PPP. We have worked with various financial entities, including multilaterals like World Bank, IFC, ADB, MIGA, African Development Bank, EBRD, EIB, etc., including bilaterals such as CDC, Proparco, DG, FMO, ECAs like UX Exim, Euler Hermes, K Exim, JBIC, China Exim. We have also helped government in advising various power projects in terms of procurement advisory. In the Africa, we have advised number of first of its kinds projects in Africa, including project in Sierra Leone. Currently, we are advising 100 megawatt power project in Botswana. We are advising BPC on that. We have advised EP on the solar auctions that they have conducted for Metara, also on some of the supports on scaling solar. We are advising ETC on solar projects in Egypt. We have advised private developer on Tunisian solar project, which were competitively tendered last year. So we advise on both government side and as well as private sides on various projects in Africa. Some of those projects are definitely first of its kinds project in those countries. That's for the introduction to Synergy.
Great, thank you, Praveen. And Gabrielle is with us now. It's good timing. Gabrielle, did you just want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what your organization is doing to support the utility sector in Africa?
Thank you very much, Andrew. So I'm Gabriel Delastour. I work at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and I'm in charge of our energy investments in what we call the South and Eastern Mediterranean region. So EBRD, we don't work in sub-Saharan Africa. We only work in North Africa, in Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt, and hopefully very soon in Algeria also, and Libya one day. Our activity we're very active in the energy sector in a number of different ways. We finance, our core business is to really finance renewable energy IPP projects, and we financed a few years back with a number of IFIs, including African Development Bank, the Benban Solar Park, which is the largest solar plant in Africa, where we financed about half of the projects. So you had about 32, I think, projects of 50 megawatt, and EBRD, we financed 16 out of those. So that's most of our activity, but we also support the state-owned utilities And we also have we're very active in financing transmission infrastructure, distribution networks, as well as the upgrade, digitalizing the grids with smart meters, smart grid solutions. And more recently, we've started also supporting utilities in reinforcing their financial management, their corporate governance to be more resilient to the climate, but also to commodity swings. So quite a wide range of activities. And in fact, we've been working closely with Synergy, with Praveen, and also with our sister organization, FDB.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Gabriel. And I think to start, obviously the issues facing Africa as a continent, its electricity sector, there's different problems affecting different countries. Egypt, for example, has managed to build up quite a lot of power capacity over the last 5 years. I remember in Egypt in 2014, it was suffering from blackouts. It's managed to develop a lot of capacity. You mentioned the Benban solar project there, Gabriel. I think the electrification rate across African continent is about just over 40% as a whole. Some countries is a lot lower than that, some countries a lot higher. But when we're talking about developing their utility infrastructure and making electricity available for all, renewable energy will play a key part in that. And I think all our speakers have mentioned that already. What models are there? How are countries developing capacity, particularly renewable energy capacity? Where I'm based in the Gulf, you've got the standard sort of IPP utility model, which is widely used. Gabriel mentioned the Benban part, which is a feed-in tariff program. So what are the options available for countries in Africa to building up capacity? Gabriel, do you want to start?
Yes, so as I said, EBRD, we only work in North Africa, so I can really give you only the point of view from North Africa, but that's maybe the closest to where you are, Andrew. I think the IPP model with a long-term government guaranteed or government offtake is still the predominant model in North Africa. Benban is one example, but Egypt, as you said, Andrew, has been very successful in developing renewables in recent years, and you also have a lot of going on in the wind area, especially in the Gulf of Suez, where you have on the Red Sea, where you have amazing wind resources, probably one of the best wind resources onshore in the world. And so the Egyptian government, ETC, NREA, the Renewable Energy Agency, have grasped on this opportunity, and there's a lot of really interesting projects going on. We financed one of them sponsored by Lekela last year, but there are also a few more coming up. So I think the IPP model is here to stay, especially as you can see very, very low tariffs. And we're also working very actively in Tunisia. We've been helping the government, get all the contractual framework, the PPA, right for the solar and wind tenders under the concession regime. And you can see last year how successful Tunisia has been in their tender. I think the tariffs were below $2.5 per kilowatt hour, which is quite amazing. Of course, maybe not as low as Dubai or the Emirates, but still for a country like Tunisia, and it's the first of its kind in the country. It was a real achievement, and I think it's really also shows how strong these countries, Tunisia, Egypt, in terms of the expertise in the energy sphere is there already, and so there's a great opportunity. So now, having said that, there's also another niche market, which is the CNI market, the private to private market. These are markets which is opening up slowly. I think it's lagging behind a bit because this is complicated. You have to get the regulation right to allow a private producer to sell directly to a private consumer and to wheel on the grid. These are things which we are very complex, and a lot of questions are raised on priority on the grid, on also what the transmission service operator should charge for using the grid, for storing the power on the grid. And these are things which we are also working in Morocco, in Egypt, in Tunisia also with the government to try to help them with these input.
Great, thank you for that, Gabriel. We'll come back to some of those programs later. Gareth, we've heard from Gabriel there about in North Africa. We've got an IPP model, predominant model there, and also there's the emergence of some other models that they're looking at, such as private to private power, where developers will sell power directly to private companies. What about the other countries in Africa that the African Development Bank is working in? What kind of models is there for developing power capacity there and renewable capacity? I assume that there's an IPP model, but what other ways does African Development Bank help utilities? I guess through loans and other ways.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. I think, I think in a way you've already kind of answered the question. I think that, what may be seen as sort of relatively well-established approaches, the IPP, the feed-in tariffs and so on, for many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, these activities are not well-established. They are, in some instances, the first time that activities can be implemented. So, approaches that seem to be run-of-the-mill or business as usual are still quite strongly additional in many sub-Saharan African countries, and they need capacity building, training and awareness raising amongst the government bodies and the regulators and so on to help put those activities in place. I think, to add to the mix, I think that we're also very conscious about the state of transmission and distribution and the condition of many of the utility companies, which in many countries are effectively bankrupt. So there's a number of additional challenges there that need to be addressed as we move forward, and perhaps some of those circumstances are contributing to a lot of interest in the development of off-grid renewable energy systems that are able to provide connections to households and communities that otherwise wouldn't see energy approaching them, through a grid for a very long time. And of course, the African Development Bank provides a full range of financial instruments, and concessional finance is a very important structure that we're still using. Concessional debt, also equity, first loss equity, and so on through some of our funds. These are all very important instruments that we're working to deploy. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Gareth. Yes, you brought up off-grid and microgrid there, which is a mechanism that is becoming increasingly important across Africa. So that leads on to the 3 Ds that we hear a lot about: decarbonisation, decentralisation, and digitalisation. We've already heard about those this week. Praveen, if you could tell us a little bit about some of the ways, the models that Synergy has worked on. You mentioned Sierra Leone already. What are the predominant models that you're seeing?
Definitely. For the countries which are very new in terms of the overall privatization, we have seen an IPP model, but not procured on a competitive basis. Some of the countries are still on a stage where they are evaluating and unsolicited proposals from number of developers active in those regions, offering tariff to the government, and government are comparing them with the marginal cost of electricity that they are procuring through emergency powers or diesel engines or thermal-based power plants, seeing its attractiveness compared to that and entertaining those proposals because they are in need of power. As you know, few of the panelists and you also mentioned that the electrification rate in the continent is close to 40%. In some of the countries I know from that perspective is even less than 25%. They are in need of power as well as the infrastructure to evacuate those power in terms of investment in transmission, more importantly, investment in distribution in terms of reduction in AT&C losses. So definitely to do that, they need a power to be procured at distribution level, not at a utility level where it can be transported from a transmission line from one location to another location. So where there is a load hub, they are looking for a power in terms of mini grid and microgrid networks, where the load center and the generator centers remains the same. So as Gabriel mentioned, there is an evaluation of CNI in some of the sector, but there is an evaluation of mini grid and microgrid structures where developer, since the development time frame in developing these small scale projects are significantly lower compared to the utility scale project, developers are inclined to see a quick megawatts on their books by developing mini grid microgrid structure, where so there's some amount of government support being offered in terms of exclusivity commitments for not bringing a competition in terms of their own distribution line to those load centers. But yeah, the demands in terms of the villages or the load centers are being made through these structures as well. Definitely IPP model is tried and tested model. Everybody would want to look at it from a utility scale perspective, but a smaller one are also being considered by developers in those regions. And there have been a lot of interest from DFI communities in financing these projects, although those standard framework have been designed, because it still involves a bit of market risk compared to the utility scale project and other risk factors in terms of payment, because you are now directly linked to the you have to secure your payment from direct retail end customer. So there is the credit risk of the customer as well. There's no standard risk allocation framework being available. It is definitely project to project basis, but this market is also being considered by developer in terms of short-term evaluation, quick wins, because utility scales take time. So yeah, that is another model being considered.
Great, thank you, Praveen. We've had a question coming from the audience. Please keep your questions coming in. Keen for this to be as interactive as possible. The question we've had in, do you see a finance deficit in some countries within Africa? I guess a problem for a lot of African countries is the local banks, financial institutions, they don't have enough liquidity to support utilities projects, which are generally fairly large, and also they can be seen as high risk. Anybody want to take this one?
Maybe I can add, Andrew, to what you said. Or maybe Gareth, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I was only going to say that, yes, I think that, there is definitely a finance deficit and, really not helped by the COVID-19 situation, which is, going to put additional pressure on the resources that are available. So, I mean, this past year, the African Development Bank has been allocated almost all of its funds now to a COVID response facility to help governments cope with the immediate impacts of the crisis and the impact of commodity prices and so on. And we've also seen instances where private power producers are suffering from inability to collect revenues and so on. We've had to provide some support there. So I think that definitely there is a finance deficit for local banks, and I think the risks are currently really quite high for investing in these spaces. So there is, in short, there's a lot of work to do. Gabriel, over to you.
Sure.
Yes, I would just add that at least our experience in North Africa shows that there are very few commercial banks that was pre-COVID, that were ready to offer the very long maturities that these projects require because of the low tariffs and the marginal profitability. And so if you look at Medban, for example, if you exclude apart from a few very small exceptions, all the financing came from development institutions like FDB, EBRD, and others. And so I think that, of course, the development bank's mandate is not to finance all the projects all the time forever. The hope is that we will be able to attract commercial lenders in the market, but I don't see this happening quite yet because of these long maturities too.
Great, thank you both. So in the panel discussion yesterday, where we had representatives from Nigerian and Kenyan government, there was sort of unanimous agreement that the main barriers to developing renewable energy was regulation and finance, access to finance. So I was going to ask now, what do you think is the key barrier to private investment in Africa? And I assume regulation is actually one of those. But Gareth, would you like to start with this one?
Well, yes, I mean, regulation clearly, and the uncertainty around the the consistent application of regulation and governance. I would think that there's still a lot of risk around payment, having to deal with utility companies, which are in many cases really technically bankrupt. So that introduces a lot of risk into the space. And I mean, I would also add the overall impact of climate change and the challenge this is having in terms of putting additional stress on economies and on infrastructure. So I would think that despite the fact that, I mean, for example, here in Cote d'Ivoire, we've had 10 years of 8% growth. There's still a lot of risk and uncertainty in many African countries as they're looking to develop these and attract finance. So things remain difficult. I think the barriers, that there are many barriers. That regulation, as you say, is a major one. Access to finance is another one, and of course that's where the African Development Bank can assist. Thanks.
Okay, it's a good point you've raised there. A lot of the discussion tends to be on implementing renewables, why that's the benefits of doing that. But you're right, there's some countries that economies are heavily based on fossil fuels, so that creates its own challenge, in that you're trying to move towards cleaner energy, but at the same time your economy is based on, or has quite a lot of its outputs from fossil fuel sectors. Gabrielle, what do you think are the main barriers to private investors investing in utilities projects?
I would say the main barriers is actually the number of projects available, and in turn how quickly and how efficiently the governments can organize the tenders and, in some case, the feed-in tariff programs. I think that there are a number of reasons why some people have seen renewable energy programs either slow down or be delayed. And in some cases, it was because, frankly, the countries didn't need more capacity on the grid. But in others, it's also related to making sure that the governments, in the ministries, there is the right knowledge and experience in organizing tenders. And I think Praveen here is the expert, so I won't speak too much about what are the key conditions to run a successful tender. But this is a very complex exercise. And if you want to be able to achieve the best tariffs, as we've seen in the Gulf, but also in Egypt and Tunisia, you need to get a number of things right in the tender. And if you want to avoid having extensive delays and some complaints of the losing bidders, etc., you need to make sure that things are done properly by the book. And this is something which is in itself a barrier. The second one is the contractual framework. The power purchase agreement is the central document, and that document needs to get the right risk allocation between the risk that is left to the investor, to the renewable energy developer, and the risk which is taken on by the off-taker, the national utility, the government. And in these two areas, the tenders and the PPAs, this is where EBRD, we focused our assistance to the government, because we know these are two sensitive and difficult steps which can be strong barriers in rolling out the programs.
Great, thank you. And I think that Praveen, Gabriel's cued you in there for project tenders. What, from your experience, are the key barriers to private companies investing in the utility sector in Africa?
There's not much point left for me to stay, but definitely, as Gabriel mentioned, a good project will never see any barrier in terms of financing. If a project is of a strategic nature, there will definitely be a political will to develop a project. So if I have to summarize, definitely the government willingness to develop a set of project is the first and foremost barrier. I have been active in the continent for past 12 years. And what I have seen is, if you have not developed a project within the one government cycle, you lose up the head start that you have within that political, one government cycle. If the government changes, you have to start, you lose the momentum. You have to now build the new relationship with the new government, even if it is a tender or it is a negotiated deal. The political will is definitely the first and foremost barrier. Then definitely you need a lot of improvement in most of the countries in the continent in terms of improvement in the regulatory framework, the institutional framework. Some of these utilities in the continents are, as Gareth mentioned, are technically bankrupt. They need some amount of support in terms of multilaterals offering backstopping the payment in terms of PRG like project, a PRG like product, or a product similar to of the IDA or IBRD PRG, or similar to the MEGA debt extension project for commercial bank to active. So all of these definitely need on some of these geographies in terms of improving the lender confidence on the project. So, as I summarize, a political will is the first. The second is the good project. Third is bankability improvement in terms of the utility financial condition that needs a lot of work, because PRG is just a small support. You eventually would want a financial standing of the utility to be self-sustainable. Therefore, a lot of reforms is required in terms of overall sector perspective. The overall retail tariff should be cost reflective of its generation. That needs to be there. And then, when it comes to setting up a retail tariff, it again goes through the full political cycle an approval from government, various authority, various bodies. So that is all required in terms of developing an electricity sector in utility, but for a particular set of project, if it is of a strategic in nature and is a good project, I don't see any hindrance, any barrier for that project to achieve closure.
Great, thanks, Praveen. And so I guess it comes down to risk. We've had this political risk and there's this COVID risk. And when you're mitigating this risk, we've already heard what can be done. So the policy is important, good project documents. Gabrielle, it would be maybe useful to get to you some insight into what happened in Egypt. You mentioned the Ben-Ban feed-in tariff program. That initially struggled in getting multilateral support for the first round, even though the tariff was very attractive. And then the second round, it did much better. What were some of the issues and how were they solved?
Well, in Egypt, I think, and coming back to what I was saying earlier, I think one of the key points was the power purchase agreement, and the reason why all the international financial institutions, the multilaterals and DFIs did not support the first round in Ben-Ban was because the PPA was not quite did not have the right risk allocation, and I can go into details, but effectively there was an issue on the arbitration clause in the contract, and this is why it's so important that this work on that external experts can contribute to governments in the region to really provide some feedback on what has been done successfully in other countries on getting the PPA in the right form. But in Egypt, I think that you mentioned also the attractive tariff in the first round, but of course, from a lender's perspective, we're not always so keen on having too high a tariff either, because a high tariff also means that in the future, the government will be tempted to try to reduce the tariff because they can find some cheaper sources of power elsewhere. So for us, for a lender, it's the best insurance against for a project against governmental risk is to make sure that the lowest possible tariff is agreed, that the consumer, the population can access the cheapest possible electricity, which means that really there's no reason for anybody to give up these projects.
Great, thank you for that, Gabrielle. So yeah, we've had some ways there in that projects can almost be de-risked, or what's the best way to approach that to try and attract finance. We've talked about renewables already, and that will play a key role in meeting energy across Africa. The panel discussion yesterday, the speaker from the Ministry of Energy in Kenya, he said, the reason I'm able to talk to you today is from solar power on a local project there, which was very interesting. So talking about green finance, Gareth, I know this is something that you're an expert on, and I'd like to know, when we hear about the financing, green finance, what exactly does that mean? I mean, in the Paris Agreement, there was mention of finance, I think something finance flows consistent with reducing carbon emissions. What does actually that mean? And, how is that different from green finance? Or is it the same thing?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, this is a very interesting area now to look at what we mean by what we term as Paris alignment, and ensuring that all investments in the future are aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, and it's specifically focusing on Article 2.1c. Of course, well, you may, or some of the listeners may know, EI Paris aligned from next year. EBRD are not far behind. I think we're probably a little bit further behind, but nonetheless, there is a great deal of pressure on all financing institutes, both public and private, to start moving towards this concept of Paris alignment. And it's very interesting because it means to be Paris aligned, well, it means a number of things, and I think we're probably still working out some of the things that it means. But from a project perspective, it means that projects need to be investing in activities that are consistent with the long-term strategies and the nationally determined contributions of the host countries. So these long-term strategies should illustrate the pathways to achieve net zero emissions in the second half of the century, or 2050, depending on which country you're in. And on top of that, the projects also need to be resilient to climate change. They need to be designed in a way that takes account of the range of possible risks that might befall those projects as climate changes, or indeed as policies change. So we see a lot of effort, a lot of emphasis now coming on sort of Paris-aligned finance. And when you compare that to green finance, there's probably quite a big overlap, but Paris-aligned finance is definitely much more specific and more demanding than what we would see as green finance. Because, for example, green finance might be a little bit more ambivalent or a little bit more flexible around the use of fossil fuels if it's being used in an energy efficient manner. Whereas certainly coal and oil under Paris alignment is now pretty much completely out. Coal definitely out. Even, there's a lot of discussion around the role that natural gas has to play, and whether some African countries may continue to use natural gas as a transition fuel towards a net zero pathway in the second half of the century. Whether that can be considered as Paris aligned is something that will be quite hotly debated, I suspect. So we'll see a number of I think institutions moving towards Paris alignment. We see things like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure in developed countries in Europe, in UK and France in particular. That's also raising awareness amongst institutions, and the next step for those institutions who are following the TCFD would be that they would probably move towards committing to Paris-aligned finance only. And then I think the other sort of thing that often gets rolled up in green finance is the concept of green bonds. And I think that there is potential for green bonds and green bonds in Africa, but before you can really raise green bonds at scale, and the African Development Bank and indeed EBRD have been doing this for a little bit of time now, the most important thing is that you have a pipeline of projects to put that money into it. That's really the limiting factor at the moment. We don't have big enough pipelines to consume this money, because as soon as it's raised as a green bond or a climate bond and so on, it needs to be deployed and put into those projects. So it's really important that we continue to build up the pipeline of projects that can then create the demand for sort of the green bond finance. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Gareth. So we've heard a bit about Paris-aligned finance and green finance. And green bonds is an interesting concept. I believe, Gabriel, you might know a bit more about this. Was it Morocco has issued a green bond fairly recently? Am I right?
Yes. So there's been a number of green bonds issued in Morocco. One of them was a few years ago to finance a PV project, which the renewable agency, the Moroccan renewable agency Mazen, had issued very successfully. In fact, I think it was oversubscribed by institutional investors in Morocco, and of course we've all followed this very, very closely. We at EBRD, we've been looking at green bonds, and we've been arranging a number of them in other geographies in Eastern Europe and the Baltics. But of course, this is something which has not been done yet. With the exception of the Moroccan green bonds for the Mazen's PV project, we haven't seen these green bonds yet, and we're looking into this to try to see, in particular, if there would be institutional investors' appetite to invest in the IPP projects. So one option, and I'm really sharing with you our reflections because we're not quite there yet. One option is to actually structure green bonds to only invest in operational projects which have been significantly de-risked. So this is one of the options we're looking into. Maybe also having a bond which has a diversification of assets across countries and type of renewables, and also assets which could also be attractive to institutional investor. But this is still at least from what we see, still on the drawing board from that perspective. With the exception, I have to say, the very successful exception of Morocco.
Thank you, Gabriel. And Praveen, talking about risk for renewables projects, I remember in the Middle East, when renewables projects were new, there was talk about, there's a bit of they're risky because it's a new technology, whereas other technologies have been used for IPPs for a long time. But renewables have actually, they're less risky in a way, aren't they? PV solar projects, less risky in that the technology is a lot easier, a lot simpler, and they're lower value as well. Is that what you found, that there's definitely been a shift now that renewable projects are regarded as less risky than conventional power projects?
That's true, mainly because the renewable energy power project does not rely on any input fuel supply. You have solar and wind energy abundantly available in the continent, coupling up with some of the technology like storage technology like battery, or even the CSP technology, where you have a storage solution available in the form of molten salt or an oil-based storage technology for CSP. There is a shift from both developer perspective and from utility perspective to see renewable energy project as a base load power project in the continent. This is still needs to be tested for the countries with the larger electricity demand, where the base load is still not met by the consistent power available through thermal power project. But there is a shift from, at least from an evaluation perspective, utilities and developers are seeing renewable as being an alternative to base load being procured through thermal power project. As an example, you must have heard about the RMIPP tender being launched by South Africa, where typically the emergency power procured elsewhere in the world are power being procured through thermal project, but this is technology agnostic tender, and in our view there will definitely be a larger mix of renewable energy or renewable energy hybrid solution, but definitely significant element of renewable energy being considered as an emergency power. And it is a very, very large tender, 2 gigawatt tender procurement, which is currently ongoing in South Africa. And I see a lot of renewable energy player being actively looking at it from that perspective. So, renewable energy definitely being considered to meet the base load, coupling with the storage technology, as well as, peakers as well.
Sure. Thanks, Praveen. Yes, that will be the game changer, I guess, for the energy transition is when storage is cost efficient. We'll come back to that hopefully before then. We've had another question from the audience. Are there enough government stimulus packages to fulfill financing gaps in infrastructure and energy projects within Africa? I mean, I assume the utility sector is a priority for governments, but I guess with COVID-19 this year in particular, that might be something that's difficult for governments. Who'd like to take this one? Government stimulus packages for energy projects for the energy sector.
Maybe I can try and answer this question, Andrew.
Sure.
Energy being always considered as the essential, you can call it a commodity or service, but it is an essential requirement for livelihood of human being in any part of the world. Therefore, it is a basic requirement for anybody to sustain. Now, in terms of stimulus package, I don't think the sector required us a kind of one-time stimulus, but what the sector required is a long-term commitment from government, because these energy projects are not just kind of a commodity where you buy, increase the demand, and then the asset is left stranded. It is a long-term commitment of 20-25 years in terms of supporting the utilities obligation in case they don't financially perform well. So it is not a stimulus that I would say is required. It is a kind of a long-term commitment from a government perspective to improve the overall sector through various reforms. I'm sure there are a lot of multilaterals active in the continent to help government in implementing those reforms, where the private sector participation and the participation from the lenders can be increased, a competition can be brought in to get the sustained tariff levels on renewable energy projects.
Maybe I can just add that I think one of the, in addition, I can only agree on what Praveen just said, and in some ways, better than a stimulus, getting the regulation right to attract investors in the long term is the way to go. However, I would also add that, of course, COVID has had a huge financial impacts on the utilities. And what we've seen in our region is a reduction in power consumption, but also a reduction in recovery of bills. I mean, in some countries, to pay your bills when you're a consumer, you have to go to a local shop to pay for your bills. And when there's a lockdown, you can't physically go and pay your bills. So the power utilities have suffered from even recovering the sales. And so I think this is where the financial support, it's a short-term liquidity support, emergency support, which is required. And this is one of the things we've done, EBRD, in Tunisia, where we're supporting STEG, the national utility, to actually sail through this period without having too much of a drop in liquidity and crunch.
Sure. Thank you, Gabrielle. It's interesting. That was discussed earlier in the digitalization panel about utilities have been unable to collect bills. So that's where investment in digital technologies is important as well, to allow development of technologies that will allow people to pay for services. And I think it's clear from all of your comments that regulation's key, and also the government needs to ensure that its infrastructure is well invested in, things like its networks, if it's going to encourage private investors to come in. I think we've got 5 minutes left. I think something that would be good to finish on, we've mentioned energy storage, which will be the game changer. So we've had batteries coming through. The green hydrogen topic is very interesting. I was discussing that with Gareth before we came on air, that the green hydrogen is something we're seeing a lot about now. I know in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia earlier this year announced a big project. There's already in Europe, there's quite a few projects underway. It'd be interesting to get your view on what you think the potential is for green hydrogen and attracting finance for green hydrogen. I mean, I believe it's quite an expensive technology, but I guess that's something that, you know, should be invested in now, and then the benefits will be reaped in the coming years. Gareth, do you want to start the discussion on this?
Yes, thanks very much indeed, Andrew. I mean, I think green hydrogen is a very exciting concept, and we're just to note, I mean, I think we can include in green hydrogen ammonia as well, because I know there are problems in storing hydrogen, so ammonia is a possible alternative approach and so on. So I think that whole kind of general concept of you know, of sort of using replacements for you know, for methane as a source of energy. So I mean, I think, you know, it's very early days, of course, but I think the potential is really quite exciting, because when you have a continent like Africa that's so well endowed with renewable energy sources, but faces so many challenges, then the opportunity to use a medium like hydrogen or ammonia to store, to transport energy, but also to replace methane. And I'm very interested in looking at the use of green hydrogen or ammonia as a replacement feedstock for the industrialization process. And I think it presents an opportunity to leapfrog a fossil fuel development technology, development pathway, you know, whereby, you know, traditionally African countries may well be eyeing the use of fossil fuels to build industrial facilities, to manufacture cement and glass and steel, you know, that we need for the building of the cities and so on. But actually, you know, if we invested in that, we could leapfrog those technology models and move to a hydrogen-based, a green hydrogen-based model. And for me, it also ties in with this concept of just transition. Those of you who are familiar with just transition, it's traditionally a labor-based movement to ensure that workers who lose their jobs as a result of environmental regulation can get other good jobs. But from a sort of a southern global south point of view, and from the African Development Bank's point of view, we also think of just transition in terms of ensuring that no sectors of society lose out on the opportunities, and that we find ways to compensate or to work with countries that have recently discovered fossil resources, but are being told that they're going to have to leave them in the ground if we're going to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And so, you know, this idea of developed countries supporting the African continent to leapfrog fossil fuels and focus on a renewable-based energy system that embodies hydrogen or ammonia as an industrial feedstock, for me, that has, you know, really that has some sort of real suggestions around a just transition. So, of course, it's very early days yet. We don't know what the technologies costs. We don't know what the best technologies are going to be, but there are a lot of hydrogen conferences taking place at the moment. You know, when you look at the risks that Praveen mentioned in terms of, you know, not relying on a feedstock for renewable energy, and the fact that, you know, that you can do all these things on just on the basis of the resources that countries have available. And I think another interesting aspect is that the renewable energy space is by definition much less prone to the kind of revenue capture or exploitation and corruption that we often see in the fossil fuel space, because, you know, it's so dispersed over the landscape that you know, it's not all tied up in one ministry and so on. So you know, I just think that the opportunities for green hydrogen are really exciting, and I think it's a new horizon that's dawning, and the African continent really has a great opportunity to get engaged. Thanks.
Great. Well, I think that 5 o'clock now, well, 5 o'clock in Dubai time, of course, 3 o'clock for you in Central African time. And I think we're all gathered from various countries around the world. So many thanks for the discussion. It's been very interesting from my point of view. We've discussed everything from the importance of regulation for project development, and that entails so many elements, from getting the documents right, ensuring that the right guarantees are in place, and the project is de-risked as much as possible. And we finished off talking about renewable energy, and also the next phase, green hydrogen. So the move towards green energy and sustainability does not just provide a way for Africa to produce electricity, to make electricity available for all of its population, but also to possibly stimulate industrial growth as well, which will be a key driver moving forward. So I'd like to thank our panelists today for joining us. I'd like to thank Gabriel de las Tours, the Associate Director from Energy for the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, Gareth Phillips, the Manager for Climate Environmental Finance Division, Africa Development Bank, and Praveen Umredkar, Director of Synergy Consulting. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to all our listeners. Hope you've enjoyed this week, and I'm sure this discussion is one that will continue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Andrew.